Happy Wednesday, everyone. Welcome back. We are in Judges chapter 7 tonight, continuing our journey through this wild and crazy book called Judges, covering hundreds of years with all kinds of people, all kinds of outcomes, all kinds of twists and turns. You know, when you study the book of Judges, you need to remember this phrase. It occurs 4 times in the book of Judges, in Judges 17, in Judges chapter 18, in Judges chapter 19, and then again at the very end of the book in Judges 21, where it says, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Here's the deal. God's original design for his people, for Israel, was not for them to have a human king, but for them to be a theocracy. A theocracy is a fancy word that basically means a government where God is king alone. No human king is needed. And in that system, God would speak through certain individuals who are generally prophets or priests. So there's this ongoing heavenly connection with God, where the people of God completely relied upon God on a regular basis. They called upon God. They sought God's desire and will through the prophets before they made decisions, before they went to war, before they changed something. And so a theocracy was really a beautiful thing, and it would set Israel apart from all the other nations who had human kings who were almost always corrupt. Think about it today. How many presidents have let you down? Every one of them in some way, no doubt. And this is why Moses, Aaron, Joshua, none of them were called God's king. Why is that? Theocracy. God was king, and they were simply his servants or his spokespeople. I want you to notice too, as you're thinking back biblically, what happened when people became king over Israel, when humans entered into that role. It's kind of interesting, we find that at the end of Samuel's life, that the people of God cried out for a human king. They said, we want a king. We want to be like the other nations who have human kings. That's a brilliant idea, right? Be like everyone else. And Samuel says, he's very brokenhearted about this. And God says, Samuel, don't feel bad. They haven't forsaken you. They've forsaken me. So the people of God, by crying out for a human king, had forsaken God. And it's interesting, God didn't directly punish them right away for this, but through these human kings, they would come upon some unbelievable hardship. You think about the first king that they installed was Saul, right? Well, and where does that human king Saul end up? Well, he oversteps his boundaries. After a battle, after a victory, he doesn't obey God, and then he steps into the role of a priest. He kind of thinks in his own mind, hey, I'm the king. I can do any of these things. And that was not true. And God takes him out of that role because of that. We think about David. And David had a lot of great qualities. He had a powerful start in his kingship, but then later in life, he gave in to sexual desire, and he failed in his walk with God and struggled, and there was punishment because of that. At another point, he numbered God's people when God didn't instruct him to do so, and there was pain and struggle and suffering because of that. Think about Solomon, who was called the wisest man of all. And yet what happened with Solomon? Well, his idolatrous wives, by the hundreds, by the way, led his heart away from the Lord. So here's Solomon, one of the wisest kings ever, who is led astray by an unhealthy relationship. That's what happened when humans tried to take over God's kingship. Power corrupts, and absolute power can corrupt absolutely. So we're in Judges chapter 7 this week. Remember, we did sort of Gideon part one last week. We talked about decision making. We talked about how Gideon was fearful, how he was hiding out when God came to call him into service, how he doubted God sort of and tested God. He asked God to make sure and prove that this was the message he was receiving, the fleece and the water and the different things. So this week we move into part two, I guess you would say, of Gideon in chapter 7. So pick up with me in verse 1 if you would. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and camped beside the spring of Harod, and the camp of Midian was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give Midian into their hands, lest Israel become boastful, saying, my own power has delivered me. Now therefore come, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is afraid and trembling, let him return and depart from Mount Gilead. So 22,000 people returned, but 10,000 remained. Then the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Therefore it shall be that he of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you, but everyone whom I say to you, this one shall not go, he shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, you shall separate everyone who laps the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, as well as everyone who kneels to drink. Now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men, but all the rest of the people kneeled to drink the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, I will deliver you with the 300. I want to pause here just a moment, because isn't this fascinating? Number one, you need to realize they were going out against 130,000 Midianites in their army. So they are 135,000. They are an army of 32,000. So to begin with, it was already 4-1. Not good odds. Not good odds at all. If I'm going into battle, I want to be the 4-1. I don't want to be the 1 against the 4 times as large of an army. So when is the last time that you've heard a general or a military leader say, you know, guys, right before battle, our army is really way too large for this. I want about 2/3 of you to go home. I've never heard that. And I would wager that no one in the military has ever heard right before battle, it's just too many guys on our side. So a question for you tonight. Why did God say your numbers are too large? Okay, so 22,000 departed who were fearful. Then God does the water test, and you lose many, many more, all the way down to 300. Kind of interesting here. God says, of the ones who drink out of their hand and lap up the water like a dog, they're keepers, but the rest can go home. Now I want to tell you, cat people, I have to say here, cats are not in the Bible. So, you know, dogs are. Here's a vote in favor of dogs. Dogs are man's best friend. So I kind of think, you know, dogs are going to be in heaven with us. Can't say the same for cats, just based on Judges. Anyway, on to Judges chapter 7. We're going to pick up now in verse 7. I'm sure I'll get some good comments from that from my cat-loving friends. And the Lord said to Gideon, I will deliver you with 300 men who lapped, and will give the Midianites into your hands. So let all the other people go, each man to his home. So the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets into their hands. And Gideon sent all the other men of Israel, each to his tent, but retained the 300 men. And the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Now just imagine that. You got 300 guys. And in this valley, this army is numberless, 135,000. In this army are at least 120,000 swordsmen. So the men took the people's provisions, verse 9. Now in the same night it came about that the Lord said to him, Arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hands. But if you are afraid to go down, go with Purah, your servant, down to the camp. And you will hear what they will say, and afterward your hands will be strengthened, that you may go down against the camp. So he went with Purah his servant down to the outpost of the army that was in the camp. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the sons of the east were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend. And he said, Behold, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it, so that it fell, and turned it upside down, so that the tent lay flat. And his friend answered and said, This is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given Midian and all the camp into his hand. And it came about, when Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, that he bowed in worship. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord has given the camp of Midian into your hands. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put the trumpets and empty pitchers into the hands of all of them, with torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, Look at me and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I and all who are with me blow the trumpet, then you also blow the trumpets all around the camp and say, For the Lord and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp. Let's pause there just for a moment and kind of pick up on something. Notice in verse 10, God understands that Gideon is still a fearful man. While he is courageously moving forward and trying to obey God, there is still some fear. And God takes a moment to personally address the fear of Gideon once again. He says, Gideon, if you're afraid, I want you to go with Purah, the servant, and draw near to the camp of the Midianites, and there's going to be a message there for you. And sure enough, there was. The Midianites were already having dreams about their destruction. The dream's kind of weird. It's like a giant loaf of bread comes rolling down the hill and flattens their camp, destroys their camp. But if you notice, the Midianite says, he says, this is God who is using Gideon to strike us down. And so God is already stirring up fear. But isn't it fascinating? He addressed the fear of Gideon first. God doesn't choose the courageous. He gives courage to the chosen. Judges chapter 7, verses 12 through 18, the Midians had these dreams, and it set the scene for the attack that was about to come. And without God placing these dreams in their minds, certainly that camp of 135,000 warriors would easily strike down the 300 men. And so we pick up then in verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. And when they had just posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. When the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers, they held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing, and cried, A sword for the Lord and for Gideon. And each stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran, crying out as they fled. And when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one against the another, even throughout the whole army. And the army fled as far as Bethshittah toward Zerah, and as far as the edge of Abimelech by Tabbath. And the men of Israel were summoned from Naphtali and Asher and Manasseh, and they pursued Midian. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against Midian, and take waters before them as far as Barbara and the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took the waters as far as Bethbara and the Jordan, and they captured the 2 leaders of Midian. Now there's more to this story as you flow into chapter 8. I would encourage you to read chapter 8 and on into chapter 9. At this point, it's kind of interesting that the armies of the Midianites fundamentally just imploded. They woke up in the dark of night, in the middle of the night, to shouts and screams, to trumpets blowing, and then to torches that surrounded their entire valley, which was probably, in their minds, a huge army that had surrounded them and already infiltrated the camp. So the Midianites just rose up and fought for their own life, killing one another. 120,000 soldiers fled or died that night by their own hands. Almost like a suicidal battle of sorts. In chapter 8, verse 28, we find that Midian was subdued and Israel had peace for 40 years. And you know, I know a lot of us would like to say, and they lived happily ever after, right? And always took care of Gideon and his family and celebrated for years to come how wonderful that victory was. No, sadly, the cycle of unfaithfulness and treachery and idolatry rises up again. And there in chapters 8 and chapter 9, there is absolutely a heartbreaking series of events in Gideon's own family, where one of his sons slaughters all of the other brothers but one. And that's really nothing new for our journey through Judges. It is a journey of twists and turns. And you know, if this were a fairy tale, I think we would just read, "and they lived happily ever after." But folks, this is real life. This is the Word of God, from God, recorded for us, of true historical events. And when you journey through it, you read and you see the humanity, and you see the temptations and weaknesses and strengths. And it reminds you that all of us have weakness and all of us have strengths. And God calls us out. So for your discussion tonight, I have 3 fundamental questions for you to think about. Number 1, how does God reduce the size of our armies to help us enlarge our faith in Him? So what are some areas of your life where God has allowed some struggle? He's allowed some uncomfortableness to bring up your faith in following Him. Number 2, how do you think Gideon's new name, Jerubbaal, affected his self-image? Now, just a quick note on that name, Jerubbaal. If you look at those last 4 letters, they spell out something, don't they? Sound familiar? That's Baal. That is the idolatrous god of that region. And so that name, Jerubbaal, actually means the one who fights with Baal. And it was given to him, remember, by his father, who had fallen into idolatry himself, but seems to be kind of proud of his son who tears down the altars of Baal. How do you think that affected Gideon as he went into this situation? Number 3, Judges chapter 7 and verse 10. We bumped into this little episode with Purah, and it's kind of interesting to me. How do you handle fear? Do you have a Purah in your life that brings calm and courage? God cared about Gideon's fear. He wanted to minister to him through that fear, so he provided a pathway through his servant Purah. So think about that, discuss those things together, and make it a wonderful rest of your week. God bless you.